My parents left me with nothing but their debt and then came back asking for help. I always thought my parents would be there for me, that they'd be the ones to help me through tough times. After all, they were supposed to love me unconditionally, right? But the truth is, I was never the favorite. That honor went to my older brother, the golden child. My parents always made it clear that he was the one who mattered most. They never cared about my struggles, never even acknowledged the things I did for them, while they doted on my brother for every little thing. It wasn't always easy to swallow, but I tried to make peace with it. I worked hard, made my own way, and never asked them for anything. It seemed like a fair trade. I kept my distance emotionally and just focused on building my own life. But then, a few years ago, everything changed. My parents went through some rough financial times and didn't want to deal with their mess alone. They came to me, asking for help, saying they needed money. It was strange considering how they had treated me my whole life. The same parents who had ignored me and left me with nothing but their debt were now asking me to bail them out. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I was trapped in some twisted reality where my parents were still treating me like an afterthought. Only this time, they needed me. They needed my help, my money, when they had never shown any concern for me. At first, I was torn. Part of me wanted to say no, to show them just how much I'd been hurt by their constant neglect. But then I thought about everything I had built and how much I had worked for it. I realized that I had a choice. They were asking for my help, but they weren't getting it without something in return. I wasn't going to let them take me for granted anymore. I knew I had to do something to set things right. I couldn't just sit back and let this happen. I was tired of being the one who always gave and never got anything back in return. They needed me. But now I was going to show them what it felt like to have to depend on someone they had treated so poorly. The day came when I decided to pull the trigger. I was going to help them, but in my own way, on my terms. And let me tell you, when I finally showed them what I had planned, they were left speechless. The look on their faces when they realized what I had done, it was priceless. Growing up, I was never the one who got the attention. From the moment I could remember, my older brother was the center of my parents' world. He excelled at everything. Whether it was academics, sports, or just being charming, he had it all. And my parents, they were right there, applauding his every achievement, never even noticing the times I stepped up, did the right thing, or tried to make a difference. My mom and dad never really paid attention to me unless they needed something. And even then, it was more out of obligation than actual concern. I worked hard in school, did everything by the book, trying to gain their approval, but no matter what I did, it was never enough. When I graduated, they didn't show up for my ceremony. My brother, on the other hand, had their full attention when he graduated a year later, and not just for the ceremony, he was showered with gifts, a fancy dinner, and a new car. I didn't ask for anything like that, but I couldn't help but feel that sting deep in my chest. It wasn't just a new car. It was their way of saying he was the one they cared about, that he was the one who mattered, and I was just there. As I grew older, I realized that if I was going to make it in life, I'd have to do it on my own. No one was going to help me, so I threw myself into work. I got a job, then another one, just trying to stay afloat. I went to college on my own, took out loans, worked part-time jobs, and did everything I could to avoid asking them for help. I made it happen, no thanks to my parents. I kept them at arm's length, mentally and emotionally. It was better that way, I convinced myself. My brother and I had always been at odds. He was spoiled, used to getting whatever he wanted, while I had to fight for everything. As we grew up, we drifted even more. He went on to college, then law school, and I heard about his big promotions and vacations to exotic places. I couldn't even afford to take a break. But everything changed when my parents came to me for help. One evening, just after dinner, I got a call from my mom. "We need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. I had no idea what was coming. She explained that they were in financial trouble. They were drowning in debt, and things had gotten so bad that they could no longer manage on their own. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the kind I had never heard before. It made me feel a strange sense of guilt, like I was supposed to help them because, well, they were my parents. They were family. But as she kept talking, something inside me started to harden. This was the same woman who never supported me, who always treated me as second best. The same father who thought I wasn't worthy of a hand up. And now they were asking me to bail them out, to put my own life on hold and fix the mess they'd made? I could feel anger rising in me. I listened to them. No, I let them tell me everything about their situation. They mentioned loans they couldn't repay, bills piling up, and a business they had invested in that was failing. And then came the part that almost broke me. They asked for $50,000. My heart sank. $50,000? The amount they wanted was insane, but somehow they expected me to say yes. I had been doing well for myself. I had saved up some money, but it wasn't much. I was still paying off my student loans, still working hard, still trying to build a future. But here they were, asking for more than I could afford, more than I felt comfortable giving. They'd never given me anything, never even showed interest in my life beyond what they could get from me. Now, they needed me, and it stung more than anything else in my life. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to help. After all, they were my parents, right? But another part of me felt like they had no right to ask. I took a deep breath and told them I would think about it. That night, I went to bed feeling torn, feeling like I was caught between the person I had become and the person they wanted me to be. I thought about how they had abandoned me for years, how I had struggled alone without anyone to turn to, and now, when they had nothing left to hold on to, they wanted me to fix it. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to help, but not in the way they thought. This wasn't going to be a free handout. I wasn't going to give them $50,000 and just wash my hands of it. They were going to earn my help, and I was going to make sure they understood what it felt like to be in my shoes for once. It was time to flip the script. I wasn't going to be the one they could always lean on anymore. If they wanted help, they were going to have to meet me halfway. And this time, they would know exactly what it felt like to be left with nothing. I spent the next few days thinking over my options, trying to come up with a way to make them understand that they couldn't just waltz back into my life and expect to be bailed out. They had treated me like I was invisible for so long, and now they were trying to use their financial desperation to manipulate me. I wasn't going to be a pawn in their game, but I knew I couldn't just turn my back on them either. They were my parents. Despite everything, I still loved them, even if they didn't always show the same affection toward me. They were in over their heads, and if I didn't help them in some way, I would feel guilty for the rest of my life. But this time, I was going to take control. The first thing I did was look into their finances. If I was going to help, I needed to know the full picture. I started going through their financial documents, taking notes, and digging deep into their spending habits. It didn't take long to realize that they had been living well beyond their means for years. They had bought things they didn't need, taking out loans and credit cards without thinking about the long-term consequences. Their lifestyle was extravagant, while I had barely scraped by. I found out they had a second home in another city that they were paying a mortgage on, a car that they were leasing, and numerous vacations that had cost thousands of dollars. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. They had never bothered to save for the future, and now, when it all came crashing down, they expected me to step in and fix it. But that wasn't the worst part. As I dug deeper, I found out that they had been hiding things from me for years. There were accounts I didn't know about, a whole network of finances they had kept secret, and it seemed like they had purposefully kept me in the dark. They had always told me they had their lives together, that everything was fine, but in reality, they were drowning in debt. I took all the information I had gathered and compiled it into a detailed document. This wasn't just about the money they were asking for. This was about holding them accountable for their choices, for the years of neglect, and for the constant expectation that I should always be there to pick up the pieces. They had never taught me the value of responsibility. They had never shown me what it meant to work hard and build a future on my own. And now I was going to teach them a lesson. I called them up the following week and told them I wanted to talk. When they arrived, I could tell they were expecting a typical conversation where they'd ask for the money, and I'd reluctantly agree. But that wasn't going to happen. Instead, I sat them down and laid everything out for them, their debts, their lavish spending, and the secrets they had kept from me. I watched as their faces drained of color, the shock and guilt hitting them all at once. They had no idea I had dug this deep. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel the heat of anger rising. "Why did you keep all of this from me? All these years, I was left to fend for myself, while you lived the life you wanted." They were speechless, staring at the pile of paperwork in front of them. It was as if they couldn't believe I had done this. that I had uncovered their lies. My dad tried to explain, saying they didn't want me to worry, that they had it under control, but I wasn't buying it anymore. They had never once tried to make me a part of their life, had never once made me feel like I was more than just the backup plan. I gave them the ultimatum. I would help them, but only if they sold the second home, got rid of the expensive car, and stopped their reckless spending habits. And I wasn't going to hand them the money either. If they wanted my help, they had to meet me halfway by making the hard decisions themselves. They were stunned. My mom tried to argue, saying that wasn't fair, that they had been struggling for so long, but I stood firm. I didn't owe them anything. I wasn't going to allow them to continue living the same way they always had, thinking that they could rely on me to bail them out when things went wrong. For the next week, I didn't hear from them. I assumed they were processing everything I had laid out. But as the days passed, I started to wonder if they would come around. Would they swallow their pride and make the necessary changes? Or would they continue to beg me for money and try to play the victim? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done being the safety net. Then, out of the blue, my mom called me. She was crying. "We've decided to sell the house," she said. "We're going to make some changes. You were right." It was the first time I had heard her admit that. It felt like a small victory, but it wasn't over yet. I had a long way to go before I could truly believe they had learned anything. But I wasn't done yet. A week later, my parents came over to my house looking defeated but determined. They told me that they had sold the second home and the car. They had also made the decision to downsize their lifestyle. I was impressed, but there was something about the way they were speaking, like they were just going through the motions, saying the right things to get the help they needed. I wasn't sure if they truly understood what it meant to take responsibility for their actions. They came to me with their usual poor us story, claiming that they had learned their lesson and now needed financial help to get back on their feet. They gave me a speech about how they were turning over a new leaf, how grateful they were for my support. But I was no longer moved by their words. I had already decided what I was going to do. The money they wanted was the last thing they would get from me. Instead, I had a far more satisfying idea that would give them the wake-up call they so desperately needed. I told them that I couldn't help them in the way they were expecting. They were confused, thinking that my decision to withhold money was some sort of temporary setback. They didn't get it. They never did. They thought that after all these years, they could come to me, ask for help, and I would just give in. But this time, I was in control. I had quietly set up a meeting with their creditors and loan officers. I had gathered all the documents and emails, including the ones detailing their financial mismanagement and the constant borrowing they'd been doing. I had also pulled together a list of their reckless spending habits over the years. It wasn't just about their debts. It was about them not taking accountability for how they had drained their own resources and ruined their financial stability. On the day of the meeting, I took them to the creditor's office. They were confused and uneasy, asking me why we were there. I told them we were going to clear things up, that they were going to take responsibility for the mess they'd created. When the creditor walked into the room, the look on their faces was priceless. The creditor handed them a folder, and they opened it to see all their debts laid out in black and white. They started to stammer, trying to explain away their financial failures. But the creditor didn't want to hear it. They were here for one thing only: the truth. And the truth was, my parents had never learned how to manage money properly, had never taken the time to figure out how to build a future that wasn't based on relying on others. I could see the shame and guilt start to settle in. My parents were no longer the ones in control. For the first time, they were the ones begging for mercy, realizing that their poor decisions had led them to this point. They thought they could control me, manipulate me with their guilt, but all they had done was fuel my desire for payback. The creditor, who had been professional up until this point, looked directly at them. "You're lucky your child is willing to help you at all," they said. "You've clearly made a mess of things, and now it's time to face the consequences. If it weren't for them, you'd be left with nothing." I watched as their faces went pale. They had never thought it would get this far. They had always assumed I would swoop in and fix things, that I would be the one to rescue them when things went wrong. But I wasn't their savior anymore. I was the one forcing them to take accountability, to face the mess they had made, and to finally own up to their own mistakes. The meeting ended with them agreeing to a payment plan that was less favorable to them than they had hoped. As we walked out of the office, I could see the weight of the situation settling in. My dad muttered something about being disappointed in me, but I didn't care. I was done with the guilt. I had done what was necessary to make them face reality. As we drove back home, my mom finally spoke. "We were wrong," she said quietly. "We should have done better, for you and for ourselves." It wasn't the apology I had been hoping for, but it was a start. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would, but I felt something more important: control. For the first time, I was no longer the person they could manipulate. They knew they had to change, not for me, but for themselves. A few months had passed since the confrontation. My parents, in their own way, seemed to have started to change. They paid off some of their debts, stopped living beyond their means, and even downsized to a smaller house. They were trying, though I knew deep down it was because they had no other choice. They couldn't go back to the way things were, and I had made sure of that. As for me, I moved on with my life. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't about to forget how they had treated me. Their shift in attitude wasn't going to undo the years of neglect, the years where I had been invisible in their eyes, but I was stronger now. I didn't need them to survive. I didn't need their approval or their love in the way I once did. One afternoon, out of the blue, my mom called me. Her voice was different this time, soft, not demanding. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "You've been tough on us, but maybe you were right. We've had to face a lot of hard truths, and I think we're better for it." I didn't know how to respond. I had always wanted her to acknowledge what they had put me through, but hearing her speak like that, a genuine thank you in her voice, caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what to feel. There was a part of me that wanted to hold on to the anger, to keep punishing them for all the years they had treated me like I didn't matter. But there was another part of me that realized maybe this was the closure I needed. My dad, too, had started showing more concern for me. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was progress. He'd called me on my birthday, and instead of the usual empty words, he asked about my life, my job, my future. It was the kind of conversation I had always wanted from him, but never thought I'd get. As time went on, I started to rebuild my relationship with them, but it was different this time. I wasn't doing it out of obligation or because they made me feel guilty. I was doing it because I had learned to let go of the past and focus on what I could control, my own happiness, my own success. One day, my mom sat me down in the living room of their smaller, modest home. It was a far cry from the sprawling house they had once lived in, but it had a warmth I hadn't seen before. The walls, now painted a simple beige, felt less like a mansion and more like a home. "We've talked a lot," my mom said, her voice shaky. "And we wanted to do something for you, to show you how sorry we are. You don't have to accept it, but it's our way of thanking you for helping us when we didn't deserve it." She handed me a check, one that was far more than I had expected. It wasn't a small amount. It was enough to pay off my student loans, to give me the breathing room I needed to truly start building my future without any financial stress. But here's the thing. I didn't want it. I didn't need their money to feel validated anymore. Their gesture, no matter how generous, was still a way to try and fix things with a simple material solution. But I wasn't looking for a check. I was looking for something deeper, something that money couldn't fix. "I appreciate it, Mom," I said softly, "but I don't need this. I don't want to hold this over you." I watched as her face fell. She wasn't angry, just sad. Sad because she had finally come to understand that the years of neglect couldn't be undone with money. The years of taking me for granted couldn't be solved with a financial check. And that was the true lesson. You can't just fix things with a quick fix, and I wasn't going to let them believe that they could. But in that moment, I realized something powerful. I had won. Not because of the money or the material things, but because I had taken back control of my life. I had stood up for myself in a way I never thought I could, and I had refused to let their mistakes define me. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her eyes filled with emotion. "I'm proud of the person you've become." I smiled for the first time in years, feeling a sense of peace. I didn't need their approval, but hearing those words meant more to me than anything they had ever said before. The apology, the lessons learned, and the progress. These were the things that mattered now. From that day forward, I built my life without the weight of their expectations. I didn't need to rely on them, and I didn't need their validation. I had learned to rely on myself, and in that, I found strength. And as for my parents, They had learned a valuable lesson too. They had learned that the love and respect I had for them wasn't something they could take for granted. They had learned that when you treat someone like they don't matter, one day they won't care anymore.